The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, but Caroline didn't hear it. Her eyes were locked on her husband's hand, his hand on another woman's stomach, his thumb tracing gentle circles, the same way he used to touch her. She was 8 months pregnant with his child, standing in a room full of 500 guests, watching her billionaire husband whisper secrets to his mistress. And that's when Caroline realized something terrifying. Vivian wasn't just his lover, she was pregnant too. What happened next would destroy a billion-dollar empire before sunrise. But here's what Preston Ashworth didn't know. His wife hadn't been crying for the past 3 months. She'd been building a case, collecting evidence, recording conversations, documenting every lie. The woman he dismissed as hormonal and unstable was about to become his worst nightmare. She left that gala in complete silence. No tears, no confrontation, no warning. By morning, Preston Ashworth had lost everything: his company, his inheritance, his reputation, his freedom. This is the story of how one woman's silence became the most powerful weapon of all. The lesson and value. What this story teaches us. This story reminds us that silence is not weakness. Sometimes the quietest people are preparing the loudest comeback. Your worth is never determined by how someone treats you. It's determined by how you respond when they underestimate you. The meaning behind this story. Every woman who has ever felt invisible in her own marriage will see herself in Caroline. Every person who has been gaslit, manipulated, or made to feel crazy for trusting their instincts will find validation here. This story proves that you are never too broken to rebuild. You are never too lost to find your way home. And you are never too silent to eventually find your voice. The real victory isn't revenge. It's reclaiming yourself. The champagne flute slipped from Caroline's fingers the moment she saw her husband's hand rest on Vivian Marlowe's stomach. The crystal shattered against the marble floor. The sound cut through the string quartet's melody like a scream. 500 heads turned toward the noise Caroline barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the other side of the Ashworth Foundation's annual charity gala, on Preston, on his hand, on that woman's body. The Metropolitan Ballroom glittered with $10 million worth of chandeliers. Women in designer gowns floated between tables draped in white silk. Waiters circulated with silver trays of appetizers that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This was the event of the season, the crown jewel of the Ashworth social calendar, and Caroline's husband was touching another woman's pregnant belly. She counted. 1, 2, 3 seconds of contact. His thumb traced a small circle. Vivian laughed at something he whispered. That laugh. Caroline knew that laugh. It was the laugh Preston used when he was being charming, when he was being real. He hadn't laughed like that with her in months. A waiter appeared at her feet. He swept up the broken glass with practiced efficiency. He didn't meet her eyes. Nobody did. The guests had already turned away, already resumed their conversations, already forgotten the pregnant woman who had dropped her drink. Caroline's silk gown clung to her swollen belly. 8 months, 32 weeks of carrying Preston Ashworth's child. She placed one hand on the curve of her stomach. The baby kicked, hard, as if sensing something was wrong. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, stared at the screen, locked it again, unlocked it. What was she going to do? Text him, call him, ask him to explain why his hand was on his director of special projects, like she belonged to him. She locked the phone. There was nothing on that screen that could help her. Eleanor Ashworth materialized at her elbow. Preston's mother moved through crowds like a shark through water. Silent, deadly. Her fingers closed around Caroline's arm with bruising force. Smile, dear, Eleanor said. Her voice was honey over broken glass. People are watching. Did you see that? Carolyn whispered. I saw you make a scene by dropping your glass. Preston, with Vivian. His hand was on her stomach. Eleanor's grip tightened. Her smile never wavered. Whatever you think you saw, you didn't. Ashworth women don't make scenes. Ashworth women don't accuse. Ashworth women smile and wave and pretend everything is perfect. But I saw... You saw nothing. Eleanor released her arm. The smile sharpened. Now go powder your nose, fix your face, and when you come back, you will be the gracious wife of Preston Ashworth III. You will be carrying the future heir to this family. You will not embarrass me again. Eleanor glided away. She joined a circle of donors near the silent auction table. Within seconds, she was laughing at someone's joke. The perfect hostess, the perfect society matron, the perfect monster. Caroline moved through the crowd like a ghost. She passed colleagues of Preston's who nodded politely. She passed wives of board members who air-kissed near her cheek. She passed the mayor and his wife, the governor and his girlfriend, a senator whose name she couldn't remember. None of them really saw her. She was just Preston's wife, Preston's pregnant wife, a prop in the elaborate production of his perfect life. She found Rachel near the bar. Rachel Whitmore, her best friend since college, the only person at this gala who actually cared about her. Rachel was nursing a whiskey. Her red hair was pulled back in an elegant twist. Her green dress was borrowed from Caroline's closet. She looked up as Caroline approached. Carrie, you look like you've seen a... Rachel stopped. Her eyes narrowed. What happened? I need to leave. What happened? I need to leave right now, Rachel. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She simply pulled out her phone and texted Marcus, their driver. The car would be waiting in 3 minutes. Carolyn turned toward the exit. The ballroom seemed to stretch forever. Each step felt like walking through water, through mud, through the wreckage of everything she thought her life was. She had to pass Preston to reach the door. He was still with Vivian, still laughing, still touching. His hand had moved to her lower back now, proprietary, possessive, the way he used to touch Caroline before she became invisible to him. Caroline walked by, close enough to smell his cologne, close enough to see the wine stain on his collar, close enough to hear Vivian say, Preston, you're too much. He didn't look up, didn't notice his pregnant wife passing 3 feet away, didn't see her at all. God, I was so stupid, Caroline thought. The signs were all there. The late nights, the locked phone, the way he stopped reaching for me in bed. I saw everything, and I chose to see nothing. She reached the door. The uniformed attendant opened it with a bow. Cold November air rushed in. It felt like waking up from a nightmare. At the threshold, she turned back. One last look at the glittering ballroom, at the crystal chandeliers, at the silk tablecloths, at her husband whispering secrets to another woman. Preston laughed again, his real laugh, the one Caroline thought belonged to her, the one she realized had never been hers at all. The door closed behind her without a sound. Marcus waited with the town car. He opened the rear door. His face was professionally blank, but his eyes were kind. Mrs. Ashworth, where to? Caroline paused. She could go home, to the penthouse on Central Park West, to the bedroom she shared with a man who didn't see her, to the nursery she had decorated alone because Preston was always too busy. No, not tonight, not ever again. My mother's house, she said. Marcus blinked. That's 3 hours upstate, ma'am. I know. She slid into the back seat. The leather was cold against her bare shoulders. She pulled the door closed herself. Marcus got behind the wheel without another word. The car pulled away from the Metropolitan Club. The Gala's lights faded in the rearview mirror. The sound of the string quartet disappeared. The champagne and laughter and lies all fell away. Caroline placed both hands on her belly. The baby was still now, quiet, waiting. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her daughter. "I'm so sorry. You have to feel this." But Caroline Ashworth wasn't going home. She wasn't going to cry herself to sleep and wake up pretending. She wasn't going to smile and wave and be the perfect Ashworth wife anymore. She was going to war. The highway stretched dark and empty ahead. Caroline watched the city lights fade through the window. New York became suburbs. Suburbs became farmland. Farmland became the rolling hills of upstate. Her phone buzzed. Preston's name on the screen. She didn't answer. It buzzed again, and again, and again. Marcus watched her in the rear-view mirror. He said nothing. Good drivers knew when to be invisible. The phone stopped buzzing. A voicemail notification appeared, then a text. "Preston, where are you? Mother says you left early." She stared at the message. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She typed a response. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. What was there to say? "I saw you with her. I saw your hand on her body. I saw the way you looked at her, the way you used to look at me." She locked the phone. Let him wonder. The car passed the hospital where she had her first ultrasound. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Preston had been there. He had held her hand. He had cried when the doctor showed them the heartbeat. "We're going to be a family," he had said. His voice had cracked with emotion. "A real family, not like mine." That was 5 months ago, before the late nights at the office, before the locked phone, before Vivian Marlowe joined Ashworth Industries as Director of Special Projects. Caroline had Googled her. 29 years old, Stanford MBA, no social media presence, no digital footprint at all, like she had been scrubbed clean. At the time, Caroline had thought it was strange, professional maybe, private. Now she understood. You don't leave a trail when you're sleeping with a married man. When you're carrying his secret, his hand on her stomach, that gesture of ownership, of intimacy, of future. Oh God, she's pregnant too. The realization crashed through Caroline like a wave. Her body went cold. Her hands started shaking. The baby kicked frantically, responding to the surge of adrenaline. "Ma'am?" Marcus's voice was gentle. "Do you need me to stop?" "No." The word came out strangled. "Keep driving." She forced herself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The way the birthing class instructor had taught her, the class she had attended alone because Preston had a meeting. Another text arrived. "Preston, are you feeling okay? You should have told me if you weren't feeling well." The audacity, the absolute audacity. He hadn't looked at her all night, hadn't danced with her, hadn't introduced her to the new donors, hadn't done anything a husband should do, and now he was pretending to be concerned. She thought about the night she had lain awake, waiting for him to come home, listening for his key in the lock, smelling the different perfume on his collar, and telling herself it was nothing, telling herself she was paranoid, telling herself pregnant women were hormonal and irrational, and she should just be grateful for everything he provided. The prenuptial agreement. She had found it 3 weeks ago, in his home office, hidden in a locked drawer. He had told her the key was lost, but Preston never lost anything. He just didn't want her to have access. She had picked the lock, a skill from her teenage years that her mother had taught her, a skill she never thought she would need. The prenup was 47 pages long, full of legal jargon and clauses and conditions. But one section had stood out, Article 12, the infidelity clause. In the event of proven marital infidelity by either party, the injured party shall receive 60% of all assets acquired during the marriage, superseding all other distribution arrangements outlined in this agreement. Preston had told her the prenup was standard. He had told her it was just a formality. He had told her his lawyers insisted on it, and it would never matter because he would never betray her. She had believed him. She had signed without reading. She had trusted the man who whispered promises in her ear and slipped a 5-carat diamond on her finger. I was so stupid, so desperate to be loved that I ignored everything screaming at me to run. Caroline opened a folder on her phone. It was labeled Insurance. Inside were files she had been collecting for months, screenshots of suspicious charges on the credit card statement, photos of receipts from restaurants she had never visited, records of hotel room charges in the city where they lived. She hadn't been crying for 3 months. She had been building a case. After finding the prenup, she had called Theodore Callahan, Teddy, her godfather, the attorney who had handled her father's estate, the man who had drafted Preston's trust documents before Caroline had ever met him. She had asked hypothetical questions about prenuptial agreements, about infidelity clauses, about what would happen if a wife discovered her billionaire husband was cheating. Teddy's hypothetical answers had been very specific. Another text from Preston. Preston, I'm getting worried. Call me, please. She typed a response. Actually sent it this time, Caroline. I'm fine, just tired. Went to get some air. Not a lie. Not quite the truth. A carefully constructed ambiguity. His response came immediately. Preston, come back. We need to present the foundation check together. Of course. The photo opportunity. The united front. The perfect couple, donating $5 million to children's hospitals, while one of them secretly stole from the very foundation they pretended to support. Because that was the other thing Caroline had discovered, the thing that made infidelity look like a minor inconvenience. The Ashworth Foundation wasn't just Preston's public relations vehicle. It was a money laundering operation. Donations went in. A fraction went to actual charities. The rest disappeared into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Teddy had helped her understand the documents. Rachel had helped her verify the transactions. Her mother, Margaret Brennan, retired forensic accountant, had helped her trace the money. They had all been watching, all been waiting, all been protecting her in ways she hadn't understood until now. Caroline, I already left. I'm sorry. I wasn't feeling well. She turned off the phone. Let the screen go dark. Let the connection to her old life sever completely. The car passed through a small town, a gas station, a diner with a neon sign, a church with a white steeple glowing under a spotlight. Normal places. Normal lives. People who didn't know that Caroline Ashworth's world had just ended, or maybe begun, because the evidence against Preston Ashworth wasn't just enough to win a divorce. It was enough to destroy him, to take his company, his reputation, his freedom. The evidence against Preston Ashworth would take down more than a marriage. It would topple an empire. Caroline leaned her head against the cold window. The baby settled. The shaking stopped. The tears didn't come. She had cried enough for this man, had given enough of herself to someone who saw her as an accessory, a broodmare, a convenient vessel for his legacy. No more. 2 more hours to her mother's house. 2 more hours to plan the destruction of Preston Ashworth III. Caroline closed her eyes, not to sleep, to prepare. The porch light was on. It was always on when Margaret Brennan was waiting for her daughter. The farmhouse looked exactly as Caroline remembered. White clapboard siding, green shutters. The same wind chimes her father had hung 30 years ago, singing softly in the November wind. Home, real home. Not the sterile penthouse with its designer furniture and empty rooms. Marcus pulled the town car into the gravel driveway. The tires crunched. The engine died. Silence. Do you need me to wait, ma'am? He asked. No. Thank you, Marcus. I'll call when I need a ride back. If I ever go back. She didn't say that part out loud. The front door opened before she reached the steps. Margaret stood in the doorway, 60 years old, silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, flannel robe over cotton pajamas, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Took you long enough," Maggie said. Not a question, not a greeting, just a statement of fact. Carolyn climbed the porch steps. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached. The baby had dropped lower in the past week, making every movement uncomfortable. She reached her mother. The tears came then. Finally, the ones she had held back at the gala. In the car, for months and months of pretending everything was fine, Maggie caught her, held her, said nothing while her daughter sobbed into her shoulder. The wind chimes sang. An owl called from the old oak tree. The night wrapped around them like a blanket. "Come inside," Maggie finally said. "I'll make tea." The kitchen was warm. The old wood stove crackled in the corner. Copper pots hung from the ceiling. The same pots Caroline's grandmother had used. The same ones her mother had taught her to cook with. Maggie moved through the familiar routine. Kettle on the stove, chamomile from the tin on the counter, honey from the jar shaped like a bear, 2 cups from the cabinet, the blue ones with the chipped handles that they had never been able to throw away. Caroline sat at the kitchen table, the same table, where she had done homework, eaten breakfast, told her mother about her first kiss, her first heartbreak, her engagement to Preston Ashworth. Maggie had not been pleased about the engagement. She had asked questions Caroline didn't want to answer. How well do you really know him? Have you met his family? What does your gut tell you? Caroline's gut had told her to run. She had ignored it. She had been so in love, so dazzled by the attention of a handsome billionaire who made her feel special. I should have listened, she thought, to Mom, to my instincts, to the voice in my head that knew something was wrong from the very beginning. The kettle whistled. Maggie poured. The tea steeped. Neither of them spoke. 4 minutes of silence. The clock on the wall ticked. The fire crackled. The tea darkened in the cups. Maggie slid a cup across the table. Carolyn wrapped her hands around it. Let the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "Mom?" Her voice was hoarse from crying. "I need to tell you something." "I already know, sweetheart." Carolyn looked up. "You know what?" Maggie reached under the table, pulled out a folder, thick, overstuffed with documents. She set it between them with a heavy thud. "I didn't spend 32 years as a forensic accountant to miss the signs of financial fraud. Your husband's been cooking books since before you married him." Caroline stared at the folder. "You knew. All this time you knew." "I suspected. Then I investigated. Then I confirmed." Maggie opened the folder. Spreadsheets, bank statements, corporate filings. The Ashworth Foundation has funneled $14 million into offshore accounts in the past 3 years alone. The charity gala you just attended. 70% of tonight's donations will end up in a shell company in Grand Cayman by next week. The numbers swam before Caroline's eyes. She had known about the fraud, had pieced it together herself. But seeing her mother's meticulous documentation made it real in a way her own suspicions hadn't. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because you needed to see it yourself." Maggie's voice was gentle, but firm. "Otherwise you'd never believe it. Otherwise you'd defend him. Tell me I was wrong. Tell me I was just being overprotective." Carolyn couldn't argue. She would have. She had defended Preston to everyone who questioned him, to friends who noticed his absences, to colleagues who heard rumors, to her own reflection in the mirror. "There's more," Maggie said. She flipped to a new section of the folder. Photographs. A woman getting into a car, a man opening a door, a child playing in a yard. Vivian Marlowe isn't just his mistress. Carolyn's heart stopped. What do you mean? She's been on his payroll for 3 years, 2 years before you even met him, and she has a 2-year-old son. Maggie paused. Let the words sink in. A son Preston visits every other weekend, when he tells you he's golfing. The kitchen tilted. The teacup slipped from Caroline's fingers. Chamomile splashed across the table. She barely noticed. A child. Preston had a child. Another family. A secret life running parallel to the one he had built with her. No! The word was automatic. Denial as reflex. No, that's not possible. He wouldn't. There's DNA evidence. Maggie's voice was steady, clinical, the way she had been when presenting fraud cases in court. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago. He got samples, had them tested. The boy is Preston's son. Caroline thought she might vomit. She pressed her hands against her belly, against the baby she had thought would be Preston's first child. His heir. His fresh start. She was his second child. At least his second. How many others were there? How many families did Preston Ashworth have scattered across the country? His name is William, Maggie said quietly. The boy, he turned 2 in September. Preston bought him a miniature electric car, spent the whole day at Vivian's apartment playing with him. September. Caroline had been 6 months pregnant in September. Preston had told her he was at a conference in Chicago. She had believed him. She had always believed him. The hardest part is admitting, I knew all along. Some part of me always knew. What do I do? Caroline asked. Her voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. That depends on what you want. Maggie closed the folder. You can go back, pretend you never saw anything, have your baby be Mrs. Preston, Preston Ashworth, until he decides to trade you in for a younger model. Or you can fight. You can use everything in this folder and everything in yours to destroy him. Take his money, take his company, take his freedom. Caroline stared at her mother, at the woman who had raised her alone after her father died, who had worked 70-hour weeks to pay for private school, who had taught her to pick locks and read financial statements and never, ever trust a man who wouldn't show you his tax returns. There's something else, Caroline said. Something I found that you might not know about. The trust clause. You know about that too. Teddy called me 3 weeks ago, after you asked him those hypothetical questions. Maggie almost smiled. The morality clause in the family trust. Any Ashworth heir who brings scandal to the family name loses their inheritance. Preston's father put it in 20 years ago, meant to control his son's wild behavior in college. Preston doesn't know about it. No, Dominic never told him. Thought the threat alone would be enough to keep him in line. Maggie shook her head. He underestimated how stupid his son could be. Caroline's baby wasn't Preston's first child. It wasn't even his second. And by morning, Preston Ashworth wouldn't just be losing his wife. He would be losing everything. The grandfather clock struck 3. Caroline had been awake for 21 hours. Her body screamed for sleep. Her mind refused to stop. The kitchen table had become a war ballroom. Documents covered every surface. Laptops glowed in the dim light. Coffee cups accumulated like soldiers fallen in battle. Rachel arrived at 2 in the morning. She had left the gala early, claiming a headache. She had driven straight upstate with her laptop and 6 months of her own investigation. I've been looking into Ashworth Industries for my paper, Rachel admitted. Her voice was tight with guilt. 6 months. I was going to tell you, Carrie. I was waiting until I had everything. Everyone was protecting me. Carolyn's voice was flat, hollow. Everyone except my husband. Rachel spread her own documents across the table. Financial records, email printouts, interview transcripts with former employees who had been paid to sign non-disclosure agreements. The fraud goes deeper than the foundation, Rachel said. Ashworth Industries has been bleeding investors for years. Preston took over from his father 5 years ago. Since then, the company has embezzled at least $23 million. Most of it went to personal accounts. Some went to Vivian. Some went to covering up previous embezzlement. Caroline scanned the documents, names she didn't recognize, numbers that made her head spin, a web of shell companies and offshore accounts that stretched across 3 continents. How did no one catch this? She asked. People did catch it. Rachel pointed to a list of names. These are employees who raised concerns. Every single one of them was fired within 6 months. Most signed NDAS with severance packages. A few tried to go to the authorities. Their complaints disappeared. Disappeared how? The Ashworths have connections. Dominic was a major donor to 3 attorneys general. Preston continued the tradition. Rachel's expression was grim. When you have enough money, you can make problems vanish. I deserved better than this. I deserved the truth. The validation whisper rose unbidden in Caroline's mind. She clung to it, used it to anchor herself against the waves of shock and betrayal. Maggie returned from her home office with another stack of papers. I found the custody documents. What custody documents? Caroline asked. The ones Preston's lawyers have been drafting. Maggie's face was hard. He was planning to divorce you after the baby was born, file for full custody, claim you were mentally unstable. The room went silent. Even Rachel, who had uncovered corporate fraud worth millions, looked shocked. He was going to take my baby, Caroline whispered. He was going to try. Maggie slid the documents across the table. His lawyers have been compiling evidence. Your anxiety during the pregnancy, the time you called the doctor worried about decreased fetal movement, the prescription for sleeping pills you got 3 months ago. Caroline remembered that prescription. She had been having nightmares. Waking up at 4 a.m, with her heart pounding. Preston had suggested she see someone, had recommended a psychiatrist friend of his, who was probably feeding information back to his lawyers. It was all planned, she said. From the beginning, he never wanted a family with me. He just wanted an heir with the right pedigree, someone from a good family who would look appropriate in photos, and someone without resources to fight him, Rachel added. Your mother is comfortable, but she's not Ashworth wealthy. Preston probably assumed you'd take whatever settlement he offered and disappear quietly. He assumed wrong. Caroline pulled out her phone, opened the insurance folder, scrolled through months of documentation. I have recordings of him lying about where he was. I have credit card statements showing hotel rooms and jewelry purchases that never came home to me. I have photos of him with Vivian at restaurants where he told me he was meeting clients. She looked at her mother and her best friend, the 2 women who had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. Between the 3 of us, we have enough evidence to bury him. The question is how deep we want to dig the grave. The clock struck 3:30. The fire had burned low in the wood stove. Outside, the first hints of gray were appearing on the horizon. Caroline's phone buzzed. She had turned it back on an hour ago. The notifications had been relentless. 16 missed calls from Preston, 12 voicemails, 27 text messages that escalated from concern to annoyance to outright threats. Play the voicemails, Rachel said. We should document his state of mind. Caroline put the phone on speaker. The first message played. Caroline, where are you? Mother says you left without saying goodbye. Call me back. Normal enough, annoyed but controlled. The second message. I don't appreciate being embarrassed like this. The foundation presentation was important. Your absence was noticed. Irritation bleeding through. Still maintaining the facade. The fifth message. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting. Again, whatever you think you saw, you're wrong. Dismissive, minimizing. The tone he always used when she questioned him. The eighth message. If you don't call me back, I'll assume you're having another episode. Remember what Dr. Reynolds said and about managing your anxiety. Gaslighting, planting the seeds of the instability narrative. The 12th message. I'm calling Dr. Pennington. Clearly, the pregnancy hormones are affecting your judgment. You need to come home now. Full manipulation mode, using her own doctor against her. Rachel recorded everything on her phone. He's already laying the groundwork. If this goes to court, he'll claim she was unstable from the start. Then we make sure it never gets to court. Maggie's voice was steel. We make sure he has nothing left to fight with. Caroline stared at her phone, at the man she had married, at the father of her child, at the monster she had been sharing a bed with for 4 years. Call Teddy, she said. Tell him it's time. The call was brief. Theodore Callahan answered on the first ring despite the hour, as if he had been waiting. I've been expecting this, he said. Your prenuptial agreement has an infidelity clause. With the evidence you've gathered, you're entitled to 60% of all assets acquired during marriage. And the trust? Caroline asked. The morality clause is ironclad. Dominic insisted on it. Any proven scandal strips the heir of their inheritance. All of it, the family fortune, the company shares, the real estate holdings, everything reverts to a charitable trust. Does Preston know? He has no idea. His father kept it secret, thought the threat would be enough without ever needing to use it. Caroline looked at the documents spread across the table. The evidence of fraud, the proof of infidelity, the paper trail of a man who had built his entire life on lies. One more question, Teddy. What happens to the Ashworth Foundation if we expose the embezzlement? The legitimate assets would be frozen pending investigation. Any remaining funds would likely be redistributed to actual charitable organizations. Teddy paused. Or they could be placed under new management. Someone who would ensure the money went where it was supposed to go. Someone like me. If you wanted, you'd have standing as an injured party, and your background in nonprofit administration would certainly qualify you. Caroline had worked for a children's literacy charity before she met Preston. He had convinced her to quit, told her she didn't need to work, told her he would take care of everything, another form of control she had mistaken for love. Draft the papers, she said. Everything. Divorce filing, SEC complaint, notification to the family trust administrators. I want it all ready to go by morning. Consider it done. She hung up. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking clock and the crackling fire. By morning, Caroline wouldn't just be divorcing Preston. She would be erasing him from the Ashworth dynasty entirely. The sky lightened from black to gray to pink. Dawn was coming. The longest night of Caroline's life was almost over. Her phone rang. Preston's name on the screen. She had been expecting this call for hours, had been preparing for it, dreading it. Answer it, Rachel said. We need to know his next move. Caroline took a breath, steadied herself, answered. Where the hell are you? Preston's voice was sharp, clipped. The tone he used with employees who disappointed him. The tone he had started using with her. I'm safe, Caroline said. That's not what I asked. My mother is humiliated. You left without saying goodbye to anyone. People are talking. Let them talk. Silence. She could hear him breathing, processing, recalculating. Caroline? His voice dropped, controlled, dangerous. Come home. Now. No. Excuse me. The single word hung in the air. Caroline had never said no to Preston. Not really. She had disagreed, negotiated, compromised, but she had never simply refused. I said no, Preston. For the first time in our marriage, I'm saying no, and I'm not coming back. She heard something crash on his end. A glass, maybe? or a vase. Preston had a temper. He controlled it in public. In private, objects paid the price. "You think you can leave me?" he laughed. The sound was ugly. "You have nothing. You signed a prenup. You'll get nothing. You'll be out on the street with a newborn and nowhere to go." "I read the prenup, Preston. All of it. Including the infidelity clause you told me didn't matter, because you'd never cheat." Silence. "I also read the morality clause in your family trust, the one your father added, the one you don't know about." More silence, longer this time. She could almost hear him thinking, scrambling, trying to figure out what she knew. "By the way," Caroline continued, "how's your other son? He must be almost 3 now." "William Wright, the one you visit every other weekend when you tell me you're golfing." The phone went dead. Caroline stared at the screen. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding, but she was smiling. She had fired the first shot. Preston had, until sunrise, to surrender. He wouldn't. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity. Teddy emailed documents. Rachel formatted her article. Maggie double-checked the financial evidence. Caroline reviewed everything, signed what needed signing, authorized what needed authorizing. At 6 in the morning, she filed for divorce. The papers landed electronically on Preston's lawyer's desk, on the Family Trust Administrator's desk, on the SEC's anonymous tip line. At 6:30, her phone started buzzing again. Not Preston this time, his father. Dominic Ashworth's voice was ice. "What do you think you're doing?" "Good morning, Dominic. I assume Preston told you about our conversation." "You're making a terrible mistake. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A family that built its fortune on fraud. A husband who maintained a secret family while playing the devoted spouse. A patriarch who cares more about reputation than truth. You'll regret this. You'll make sure I what? Sue me, threaten me, have me declared unfit." Caroline's voice was steady, strong. "I have documentation of every crime your family has committed for the past decade. Financial records, audio recordings, witness testimonies. If anything happens to me or my child, it all goes public. Every newspaper, every television network, every regulatory agency." Silence. "Your son isn't just losing a wife, Dominic. He's losing his inheritance, his company, his freedom. The only question is whether you want to go down with him." She hung up before he could respond. Rachel looked at her with something like awe. "I've never seen you like this. I've never been this angry before." Caroline sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly exhausted, suddenly aware of how long she had been awake. "Or maybe I have been. Maybe I've been angry for years and just didn't let myself feel it." Maggie brought fresh coffee, set it in front of her daughter, squeezed her shoulder. "The anger is good," Maggie said. "The anger means you're finally fighting back." But even as she said it, Caroline could feel the anger shifting, changing, becoming something else. The rage was a surface emotion. Underneath it was grief, loss. The death of the future she had imagined. She had loved Preston, despite everything, despite all the red flags and warning signs and late-night suspicions. She had loved the man she thought he was, the man he pretended to be. That man had never existed. She was mourning a ghost. At 7 in the morning, a black SUV pulled into Maggie's driveway. Caroline watched from the window. 3 men in suits stepped out. Expensive suits, the kind Preston's lawyers wore to intimidate. They approached the house, knocked on the door, professional, polished, ready to negotiate the surrender of a difficult wife. They had no idea what they were walking into. Caroline opened the door, 8 months pregnant, wearing an old college sweatshirt and borrowed jeans. Her hair was a mess. Her eyes were red from crying. She had never felt more powerful. "Mrs. Ashworth," the lead attorney, cold, efficient. "Your husband requests your immediate return. He's prepared to forgive this unfortunate episode. Forgive. Caroline almost laughed. I don't need his forgiveness. He also wants you to know that if you pursue any legal action, he'll have you declared unfit. The pregnancy hormones, the erratic behavior, leaving in the middle of an event without explanation. He has witnesses who will testify to your instability. Then he should know that I have a forensic accountant, an investigative journalist, and the family attorney who drafted his trust documents. He should also know that I have already filed. The attorney blinked. Filed what? Everything? Caroline smiled. Divorce papers with the infidelity evidence, a formal complaint to the SEC about the charity fraud, and a very detailed email to his father about the morality clause. The attorneys looked at each other. Something passed between them. Uncertainty. Fear. Mr. Ashworth would like to negotiate, the lead attorney said carefully. There's nothing to negotiate. I've already won. She closed the door in their faces. Through the window, she watched them retreat to the SUV. Make phone calls. Gesture frantically. The car didn't leave. They were waiting for instructions. Preston had until sunrise to surrender. The sun was up. Now the real battle would begin. The attorneys came back 3 more times. Each offer was larger than the last. $20 million. Then 30. Then $50 million to make the whole thing go away. Caroline refused them all. You could take the money, Rachel said. They were in the living room now. The kitchen had become too crowded with documents. $50 million is enough to start over anywhere. It's not about money. Caroline stood at the window, watching the SUV, watching the men in suits make desperate phone calls. It's about justice. Justice is expensive, Maggie observed, and exhausting, and sometimes it doesn't come at all. Then I'll exhaust myself trying. The morning news came on. Rachel turned up the volume. A financial reporter was discussing unusual activity in Ashworth Industries stock. Sources tell us that trading has been unusually volatile this morning. There are unconfirmed reports of an SEC investigation, though neither the company nor regulators have issued statements. It was starting. The first cracks in the empire. Bennett Cross called at 9:30. The CFO of Ashworth Industries, a man Caroline had met at dozens of company functions, quiet, nervous, always looking over his shoulder. Caroline, his voice was low, urgent. I need to talk to you. How did you get this number? I've had it for 2 years. Since the Christmas party. He paused. I tried to warn you then, about the accounts, about what Preston was doing. You didn't hear me. She remembered that party, remembered Bennett hovering nearby, starting conversations that never quite went anywhere. She had thought he was just awkward. I'm hearing you now, she said. I have documents. Everything Preston tried to bury. Every account he tried to hide. I've been keeping copies for 3 years. His voice cracked. I stayed because I thought I could fix it from the inside, protect the employees who didn't know what was happening. But it just kept getting worse. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're the only person who might actually be able to stop him. Bennett took a breath. And because you were always kind to me at those parties, when everyone else treated me like a servant. You asked about my family, remembered my daughter's name. Caroline had forgotten that. The small kindnesses, the human moments, in the performance of being Mrs. Preston Ashworth. I'll testify, Bennett said. Whatever you need, I'll tell them everything. Thank you, Bennett. Thank you for fighting back. Someone had to. She hung up. Rachel was already taking notes. The CFO turning witness is huge, Rachel said. That's insider testimony. That's documentation we couldn't get any other way. It's also a man risking everything to do the right thing. Caroline felt something shift inside her. He stayed for years trying to fix it, just like I stayed trying to make my marriage work. We were both trapped by the same monster. The doorbell rang. Caroline tensed. More lawyers, more offers, more attempts to buy her silence. But it wasn't attorneys at the door. It was Eleanor Ashworth. Preston's mother stood on the porch, perfectly composed, designer coat, Chanel bag, pearls, every inch the society matron. Maggie stepped forward. I don't think you're welcome here. I'm not here to cause trouble. Eleanor's voice was different, smaller, more human than Caroline had ever heard it. I'm here to help. Caroline stepped past her mother. Why would you help me? Eleanor's mask cracked, just slightly, just enough to show the exhaustion underneath. Because my grandchild deserves better than what Preston can offer. Because I've spent 40 years covering for Ashworth men, and I'm tired. Because I know where all the bodies are buried, and it's time someone started digging. She held out a flash drive. Small, silver, heavy with secrets. Bank records, offshore accounts, payoff agreements, everything Dominic has hidden for decades. Eleanor's hand trembled. I married into this family when I was 22 years old. I've been an accomplice ever since. Maybe this is how I start making amends. Caroline took the drive. Why now? Why not years ago? Because years ago, I was afraid of Dominic, of losing my position, of being nothing. Eleanor's eyes glistened. But my grandson is about to be born, and I refuse to let him grow up in the same poison that destroyed my son. It was the most honest thing Caroline had ever heard Eleanor say. I can't forgive you, Caroline said, for all the years you knew, for every time you told me to smile and pretend. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to do one thing right. Eleanor straightened her spine. Whatever you need, whatever it takes to bring that family down, I'll help. Even if it destroys me too. The doorbell had stopped ringing. The lawyer's SUV was gone. The morning was quiet except for birdsong and wind chimes. Caroline looked at the flash drive in her hand, at her mother-in-law's haunted face, at the life she was about to demolish. No mercy, no surrender, no going back. Come inside, she said. We have work to do. They worked until noon. Then Eleanor left. Rachel left. Even Maggie retreated to her office. To review the new documents, Caroline was alone. She climbed the stairs to her childhood bedroom. The wallpaper was the same pink from when she was 12. The bedspread was the same patchwork quilt her grandmother had made. The window looked out over the same fields she had gazed at as a teenager, dreaming of escape. She had escaped, all the way to a Central Park penthouse, all the way to a 5-carat diamond ring, all the way to a marriage built on lies. The adrenaline was gone. The fury had burned itself out. All that remained was grief. Caroline sat on the too-small bed, pressed her hands against her belly, felt her daughter move inside her. I loved him, she whispered to the empty room. I actually loved him. How could I be so stupid? The breakdown came. Not the elegant tears of movie heroines, ugly, gasping sobs that shook her whole body, snot and salt and years of suppressed pain flooding out all at once. She cried for the wedding she had believed was real. For the honeymoon in Bali, where Preston had seemed so devoted. For the night he had proposed under the stars on his yacht, promising forever. She cried for the pregnancy test she had taken alone because he was traveling, for the ultrasound appointments he had missed, for the nursery she had decorated by herself while he was with Vivian. She cried for the woman she had been before she met him. Confident, independent, happy with her non-profit job and her small apartment and her simple life. That woman was gone, buried under 4 years of Preston Ashworth's molding. his preferences, his schedule, his demands. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible, even to myself. The baby kicked frantically, responding to the storm of stress hormones flooding Caroline's body. She forced herself to breathe, to calm down, to remember that there was a tiny person depending on her to survive this. Maggie appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak, just sat down on the bed and held her daughter while she cried. "I wasted 4 years, Mom." "You didn't waste them." Maggie stroked her hair. "You survived them. There's a difference. I should have seen it sooner, should have left sooner. Maybe, or maybe you needed to reach this moment, this exact moment when you were strong enough to fight back." Maggie's voice was soft. "The Caroline who married him wouldn't have survived this. You needed to become someone else first." Carolyn thought about that, about the woman who had signed that prenup without reading it, who had believed every lie because she wanted so badly for them to be true. That woman was weak. That woman was desperate for love. This woman was neither. "I'm scared," Caroline admitted, "of what comes next, of raising a baby alone, of being the woman who destroyed the Ashworth empire." "Good. Fear means you understand what's at stake." Maggie pulled back, looked her daughter in the eyes. "But you won't be alone. You have me, you have Rachel, you have Teddy and Bennett, and even, God help us, Eleanor." "What if I fail? What if you succeed?" Carolyn didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't let herself imagine success, hadn't let herself picture a future beyond the next few hours. "Take a shower," Maggie said. "Put on clean clothes. Eat something, then we'll talk about what comes next." She left. Caroline sat alone for another moment, gathering herself, preparing for whatever the afternoon would bring. The shower was hot, almost scalding. She stood under the water until her skin turned pink, until the tears washed away, until she felt clean for the first time in years. She dressed in clothes from her old closet, jeans that barely fit over her belly, an oversized college sweatshirt. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman looking back, but maybe that was good. She had spent 4 years becoming Caroline Ashworth. It was time to remember who she was before. By 3 in the afternoon, the news had broken. Someone had leaked documents to every major financial outlet. The SEC announced a formal investigation into Ashworth Industries. The stock price dropped 15% in an hour. Board members were resigning. Lawyers were fleeing. Caroline watched from Maggie's living room. Rachel sat beside her, phone buzzing with messages from her editor. "I didn't leak anything," Rachel said. "I was going to wait until tomorrow. Give Preston time to make things worse for himself." Then who did? A text from Teddy answered the question. Eleanor, she decided to protect the grandchild over the son. Caroline stared at her phone. Her mother-in-law, the woman who had told her to smile and pretend, the woman who had chosen appearances over truth for 40 years. In the end, she chose family over facade. The living room television showed footage of the Ashworth Industries headquarters. Reporters clustered outside. Employees streamed out, looking shell-shocked. The empire was crumbling in real time. Preston's face appeared on screen. File footage from better days. Handsome, charming, the golden son of a golden family. The anchor's voice narrated the fall. Sources indicate that Preston Ashworth III may face criminal charges related to charity fraud and embezzlement. His wife filed for divorce this morning, citing infidelity and financial misconduct. His wife, that was still her, for a few more days at least. The phone rang. Preston, again. This time she answered. "Carrie?" His voice was different, broken, the arrogance stripped away. Please, I can explain everything. You can't. The business, my father. You don't understand the pressure I was under. I understand that you had a choice. Every single day, and at every single day, you chose to lie to me. I love you. She almost laughed, almost cried. The word meant nothing coming from him. It never had. No, Preston. You loved what I represented. The perfect wife, the perfect family photo, the air you needed to secure your position. She kept her voice steady. You never loved me. You don't even know who I am. I can change. We can go to counseling. Start over. It's too late. It was too late the moment you put your hand on that woman's stomach. Silence. Then something she had never heard from Preston Ashworth. A sob. Please, I'm losing everything. You already lost me. Months ago. You just didn't notice. She hung up. The news coverage continued. More revelations. More footage. More experts analyzing the downfall of a dynasty. At 5 in the evening, the Ashworth Industries board convened an emergency meeting. At 6:30, they announced Preston's removal as CEO. At 7, Dominic Ashworth issued a statement condemning his son's actions and distancing the family name from the scandal, father throwing son under the bus. The final betrayal. At 8, Teddy arrived with the settlement papers. They're offering everything, he said. 60% of marital assets per the prenup. Full custody with no visitation until psychological evaluation. The New York apartment, the Florida house, the family foundation under your control. Caroline read the documents. Everything she had asked for, everything she had fought for. Preston loses his inheritance under the morality clause, Teddy continued. The family trust administrators confirmed it this afternoon. He's essentially penniless, except for whatever he's hidden offshore. And the offshore accounts, frozen pending the SEC investigation. He'll be lucky to afford a public defender. Caroline signed the papers. Her hand didn't shake. Maggie opened a bottle of wine. They didn't toast. There was nothing to celebrate. Just an ending. Just the closing of one chapter before another could begin. Rachel's article went live at 9. The full investigation, the secret family, the fraud, the manipulation, everything laid out in meticulous, devastating detail. By midnight, Preston Ashworth was destroyed. Caroline stood at the window. The night was dark. The stars were bright. The wind chimes sang their quiet song. She had won against all odds, against a billion-dollar empire, against a family that had been buying silence and dodging consequences for generations. She placed both hands on her belly. Her daughter kicked. It's over, she whispered. He can't hurt us any more. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. The legal battles would continue for months, maybe years. There would be depositions and hearings and custody evaluations. Preston would fight. His father would fund whatever appeals he could manage. The Ashworth machinery would grind on even without its crown prince. But she had something they didn't. She had the truth. She had people who loved her. She had a daughter who would grow up knowing that her mother was not a victim. That was enough. That was everything. 1 week later, Caroline sat in Dr. Pennington's office. Routine checkup. The baby was healthy, active, ready to meet the world. You've been through significant stress, Dr. Pennington said carefully. How are you holding up? Better than I should be. Caroline paused. Is that wrong? Should I be more devastated? There's no should in grief. Everyone processes differently. Dr. Pennington made a note in her chart. But if I'm being honest, you seem more at peace than I've seen you in months. It was true. The constant anxiety that had plagued her pregnancy was gone. The insomnia, the racing thoughts, the feeling that something was terribly wrong that she couldn't name. I kept thinking it was hormones, Caroline said. The worry, the fear. Preston kept telling me it was hormones, that I was being irrational. You were having a normal response to an abnormal situation. Your body knew something was wrong even when your mind refused to accept it. Carolyn thought about all those nights lying awake. The 3 a.m. Google searches, the pretending to be asleep when Preston came home late. Her body had been screaming warnings. She had refused to listen. Never again. She would never ignore her instincts again. That afternoon, she agreed to meet Vivian Marlowe. Everyone thought it was a terrible idea. Maggie, Rachel, Teddy, even Eleanor, who had her own complicated feelings about her son's mistress. But Caroline needed to understand. Needed to see the woman who had shared her husband's lies. They met at a coffee shop in a small town. Neutral territory. No cameras, no witnesses. Vivian looked older than her 29 years, tired, haunted. Her hands shook around her coffee cup. I didn't know, she said, before Caroline could speak, about the fraud, about his plans for you. I thought... She stopped, started again. I thought I was the love story. I thought you were the arrangement. He told you that. He told me everything I wanted to hear. Vivian's eyes glistened. That you didn't love him. That the marriage was for appearances. That once you had the baby, he'd leave and we'd finally be a real family. And your son, William. The tears spilled over. He barely sees him. He sends money. He sends toys. He doesn't come. He never really came. Caroline studied the woman across from her. Not a villain, not a home wrecker, just another victim of Preston's manipulations. Another woman who had believed his lies. I'm not going to forgive you, Caroline said. I can't. You knew he was married. You made choices. Vivian nodded, accepting. I know. But I understand that you were used to a different kind of victim, but still a victim. Something shifted in Vivian's face, relief maybe, or just the acknowledgement of a truth she had been denying. What will you do now? Caroline asked. My parents? In Oregon. I'm taking William there, starting over. Vivian wiped her eyes. I don't want anything from him. Not the money, not the support. I just want to be free. Then be free. They didn't hug, didn't exchange numbers, didn't promise to stay in touch. Some connections were too painful to maintain, but as Caroline drove back to her mother's house, she felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, but release. The letting go of anger she had been carrying for someone who wasn't worth the wait. The apartment in New York was being prepared for her return. Carolyn had hired decorators. Real ones, not the ones Eleanor had imposed on her. She was choosing her own colors, her own furniture, her own life. Are you sure you're ready? Maggie asked as they packed the car. No, but I'm going anyway. Caroline loaded the last box. The baby will be here in 4 weeks. I need to be home. That apartment was never your home, sweetheart. I know, but it will be. I'm going to fill it with my things, my memories, my life. I'm going to make it mine. Maggie hugged her for a long moment. Mother and daughter, survivors of different wars. Call me if you need anything. I will. I mean it. Anything, even if it's 3 a.m. and you just need to hear my voice. I know, Mom. I love you. I love you too. Always. The drive back to the city took 3 hours. Caroline watched the farmland turn to suburbs, turn to skyscrapers. The same route she had traveled a week ago. Everything different now. She was leaving her mother's house the same way she had arrived, in silence. But this silence was different. This silence was peace. 3 months later, a different woman opened the door of the Central Park West apartment. She was holding a baby girl, Ruby Margaret Brennan. No Ashworth anywhere in the name. The apartment was transformed. The cold white walls were now warm cream, the sterile, modern furniture replaced with comfortable pieces from antique stores. Family photos everywhere. Real ones, not posed portraits for magazines. Caroline carried Ruby to the window. The view was the same, Central Park stretching green and alive below. The city humming its eternal song, but she saw it differently now. She finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked all along. She'd been her own warden, and now she'd set herself free. Ruby fussed, hungry. Caroline settled into the rocking chair her mother had shipped from upstate, the same chair Maggie had used when Caroline was a baby. 3 generations of women, connected by love. As she nursed her daughter, she thought about the woman she had been, the woman who had walked into the Gala, 8 months pregnant and invisible, the woman who had dropped a champagne glass and watched her world shatter. That woman had been afraid, desperate, clinging to a marriage that existed only in her imagination. This woman was none of those things. The doorbell rang. Teddy, arriving for their weekly meeting. He brought documents about the foundation, the Brennan Family Foundation now. No more Ashworth, no more fraud. The first grants had been distributed last month. Women's shelters, financial literacy programs, resources for mothers leaving abusive situations, real help for real people. Preston's trial starts next month, Teddy said. He was gentle about it, always gentle. The prosecutors want you to testify. I know. Are you going to? Caroline looked down at Ruby, at her daughter's perfect face, her daughter who would grow up knowing the truth. Yes. She adjusted the baby in her arms. Someday she's going to ask about her father. I want to be able to tell her that I told the truth, that I didn't hide, that I stood up and said what he did. It won't be easy. His lawyers will try to paint you as vindictive, unstable, everything they threatened. Let them try. I have the evidence. I have the witnesses. I have nothing to hide. Teddy smiled. You've changed, Caroline. I remembered who I was. Before him, before the lies. She met his eyes. That woman was always in there. She just got lost for a while. After Teddy left, Caroline put Ruby down for her nap. She stood at the window, watching the sunset over the park, orange and pink and gold spreading across the sky. Her phone buzzed, a text from Rachel. You should see the paper tomorrow. We won a Pulitzer. The investigation, the article that had brought down the Ashworth Empire. It had won the highest honor in journalism. Another text. From Bennett Cross, now cooperating fully with federal prosecutors. The new board voted. Ashworth Industries is liquidating. Dominic is facing his own charges. The empire was gone. The patriarch was falling. The son was awaiting trial. Everything Preston had valued more than his wife, more than his children, more than basic human decency. All of it dust. A final text. Unknown number. Caroline almost didn't open it. From Vivian, thank you, for not destroying me too. I'm getting help. William and I are starting over. You gave us that chance. Caroline put the phone down. She walked to the nursery, stood over Ruby's crib, watched her daughter sleep. She thought about the Gala, about the champagne glass shattering, about the door closing behind her, without a sound. She had walked into that ballroom as Preston Ashworth's pregnant wife, an accessory, a prop, a vessel for his legacy. She had walked out as herself, as Caroline, as a woman who would not be silenced or diminished or erased. The baby stirred, opened her eyes, met her mother's gaze with that unfocused newborn stare. I'm going to tell you a story someday, Caroline whispered, about a woman who forgot who she was, who let someone convince her she was small and stupid and worthless, who almost lost everything, Ruby yawned, tiny fists waving. And I'm going to tell you how she remembered, how she fought back, how she built a new life from the ashes of the old one. She reached into the crib, stroked her daughter's cheek. That woman was your mother, and she wants you to know that you are never too broken to be whole again. You are never too lost to find your way home. You are never too silent to find your voice. Ruby grabbed her finger, held on tight. We're going to be okay, Caroline said. We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be everything. The city lights began to twinkle outside the window. Night falling. A new chapter beginning. Caroline picked up her daughter, held her close, let the peace wash over her. She had walked into that gala as one woman. She had walked out as another, and in the space between those two people, she had found something she thought she had lost forever. Herself. The end was really just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed. Media in the gallery. Cameras waiting outside. The trial of the decade, they called it. Preston Ashworth sat at the defense table. He had aged 10 years and 12 months. His expensive suit hung loose on a thinner frame. His golden boy smile was gone. Caroline sat in the witness box. Composed? Steady. Ruby was at home with Maggie, who had moved to the city to help raise her granddaughter. The prosecutor walked her through the evidence, the fraud, the secret family, the manipulation, everything she had uncovered in those desperate hours after the gala. Preston's lawyers tried to break her, implied she was bitter, vengeful, motivated by greed. She answered every question with calm precision. No tears, no drama, just facts. When it was over, when the jury filed out to deliberate, she walked past the defense table. Preston looked up at her. His eyes were hollow. Was it worth it? He asked. Destroying everything. She stopped, looked at the man she had married, the man who had broken her, the man who had made her stronger than she ever knew she could be. You destroyed yourself, Preston. I just told the truth. She walked out of the courtroom, into the sunshine, into a future that belonged to her alone. The jury came back in 4 hours, guilty on all counts, 23 years in federal prison. Caroline didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate, just justice, finally served. That night she sat in her apartment with Ruby in her arms. The city sparkled outside the window. The wind chimes from her mother's porch hung in the nursery now, singing softly when the breeze came through. She thought about everything she had lost, everything she had gained, the woman she had been, the woman she had become. His pregnant wife had left the gala in silence. By morning, the billionaire was destroyed. But that wasn't really the story. Not the important part. The real story was about a woman who remembered her voice, who found her strength, who built a new life from the ruins of lies. The real story was about survival, about resilience, about the quiet power of refusing to be invisible anymore. Caroline kissed her daughter's forehead, watched the lights of the city dance. Once upon a time, she whispered, there was a woman who thought she was lost, but she wasn't lost at all. She was just waiting to be found. Ruby smiled in her sleep. Outside, the city hummed its endless song. And Caroline Ashworth, no, Caroline Brennan, was finally completely home. If this story moved you, if you felt Caroline's pain and cheered for her strength, you're not alone. Thousands of listeners have found hope in stories just like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Caroline's shoes? I read every single comment, and your story might inspire our next video. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We post new stories every week. Stories about strength, survival, and the quiet power of women who refuse to be underestimated. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes a story is exactly what someone needs to take their first step toward freedom. And if this story touched your heart, leave a like. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. Closing statement. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted with intention, designed not just to entertain, but to inspire, validate, and empower our audience. Thank you for being part of this community.